In part 1 of this series, a point is made. Violent or otherwise negative behavior caused by replicating entertainment is not exclusively caused by video games. It can be from television, film, music, or from other people's behaviors. People do stupid things for a variety of reasons, so why is it that the media is so quick to pin the blame on video games? Does the media have an agenda against video games? Why does it seem like in any controversy surrounding video games, media outlets never talk to people who really understand the industry? Should we even care about what they have to say? Perhaps one of the reasons for some of the toxic defensiveness found in the gaming community can be traced back to the portrayal of gaming in popular news media. Part 2 of this series will attempt to come to a conclusion surrounding not only the media's perception toward video games, but the general population's perception too. Is there reason to fear?
Cold-blooded murder is making Mortal Kombat the most popular video game in history. Kids relish their victory and their bloody choice. Should they pull out their opponent's heart, or simply rip his head off?
Like most stories, it may be best to start at the beginning. The infamous origins of the ESRB, America's Video Games Ratings Board, are well documented and widely known. However, the call for action after games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap was definitely not the first time video games had garnered widespread controversy. The entire history of video game controversy dates back to 1976 with Death Race, a game based on the 1975 movie Death Race 2000.
Death Race 2000, rated R.
The goal of the game was simple: hit random bystanders for points, just like in the movie. Though, despite its rudimentary visuals and basic gameplay, it was enough to get the game removed from stores and any further production cancelled after the public outcry against it. The early days of video games were their most tumultuous. Despite the age of information technology we live in today, there really haven't been too many published products that have stirred the pot quite like some did during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Really, the most controversial games of the past decade due to offensive content might be Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Hatred, and Active Shooter. Modern Warfare 2 for its infamous no Russian scene, and Hatred and Active Shooter for their realistic depictions of violence against innocent people in domestic settings. While Modern Warfare 2's controversy began and ended with one level, Hatred and Active Shooter's controversies were deeply tied to the cores of those two games. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 was one infamous ordeal, but as for the other two games, they were almost immediately banned from Steam once mainstream news and gaming news outlets started covering them. Case open and closed. One of the first controversies that plagued console games as opposed to arcade games was the publishing of pornographic titles on the Atari 2600, such as the infamous Custer's Revenge. Custer's Revenge depicted the rape of a Native American woman at the hands of the player character, a cartoonishly horned up version of the very much real General Custer. It wasn't the only game of its type to appear on the Atari 2600, but it was and still is the most infamous. The other games of its kind aren't any less offensive either. Beat 'em and Eat 'em, Gigolo, etc. These weren't games that were on the shelves in Toys R Us, that's for sure. In fact, they came in leather sleeves so the box art wasn't completely on display.
At the stores, you had to ask for it because it was either hidden behind the counter or in the back room.
One of the distributors says there's been a lot of interest.
You've seen one of them called Custer's Revenge?
Yes, I have.
What is it like?
It's, the graphics aren't bad.
Time for the big ones, Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, specifically how the ESRB sprung from the realistic depictions of violence, which are highly cartoonish by modern standards, but were heavily featured in both of those games. Both use FMV, full motion video, to different ends. The entirety of Night Trap is made up of interactive FMVs, while Mortal Kombat used real renders of actors as the character models. Night Trap has players protecting a slumber party from hostile invaders by utilizing the house's built-in traps, while Mortal Kombat, you know how it goes.
Sub-Zero wins. Flawless victory. Fatality.
If someone were to be asked why they thought the ESRB was created, it might be safe to assume that many people would say that it was a result of public outcry and the organization was put in place via direct government order as a response. And for the most part, they'd be correct. However, the creation of the ESRB was also due in large part to our friendly neighborhood Nintendo. Howard Lincoln, former chairman of Nintendo of America, made a strong case against Nintendo's direct competitor at the time, Sega, at the hearing that ultimately resulted in the creation of the ESRB. Lincoln explicitly mentions that without without a rating system, games like Night Trap would end up in the hands of children, and that Night Trap was being purchased by children.
There was no rating on this game at all when the game was introduced. Small children bought this at Toys R Us, and he knows that as well as I do.
In a hearing ripe with non-industry experts and aging congressmen, perhaps the most catalytic moment in the entire session was when Lincoln, an industry leader, condemned the actions of Sega for their negligence regarding rating systems and their enforcement. To take away some of the blatant lies presented during that hearing, that Night Trap rewards the player for femicide, that video games as a whole promote homophobia, sexism, and racism, etc., etc. Lincoln's words may not have exclusively been the reason we have the ESRB, but they may have been the most important. Even without some of the most swaying evidence toward Congress that day, Lincoln may have been the man who sealed the deal more than anyone else. Also, unlike everyone else there, he also provided the most understandable reasons behind implementing a rating system, while simultaneously being the most qualified. While he may be a reason we have the ESRB, and while he may have been taking advantage of a situation that put Sega in a bad light, he did present a strong case that day. Bill White, a representative for Sega of America, did point out as a response that gaming should have been able to regulate itself, but to no avail. Sega was fighting an uphill battle and was losing.
Just putting these ratings on, if that's as far as we're going to go, isn't going to get us anywhere. We've got to get further into this.
So, did Nintendo create the ESRB out of spite for Sega? Not necessarily. This was a conversation that was a long time coming. Film had seen a crackdown very soon after Nickelodeons across the country had started showing them. Government-mandated censorship began in 1915, just 1 decade after the first movie theater opened in 1905. The MPAA, the Films Ratings Board, was established in 1922. The first arcade cabinet was created in 1971. The ESRB was founded in 1994, 23 years later. However, like gaming, film had many cases of censorship and boycotting well before the establishment of any nationwide censorship rulebook. The Kiss was the first ever portrayal of a kiss on screen. It was an absolute scandal. Many saw it as indecent, pornographic even. The church was involved, and many called for police action. Essentially, Death Race was gaming's version of the Kiss. The establishment of a nationally standardized rating system for video games was something that, in retrospect, could have happened sooner. However, video game protests and other controversies of the era were mostly thorns in the sides of video game players at the time. In the 80s, there was a relatively large movement that equated video games with drug use. The establishment of a rating system was a worrying sign that the government would start taking serious action against video games as an art form, like they were giving in to the controversy. Though, after April 20th, 1999, video game controversy suddenly went from a tedious annoyance to an extremely serious issue for all relevant parties.
The gun is right outside the library door, okay? I don't think I'm going to go out there. Okay, you're at Columbine High School? I got 3 children. Okay, we got it. Okay? I'm not going to go to the door to shut the door, okay? I've got the kids on the floor. I got all the kids in the library on the floor. We have paramedics, we have fire, and we have police en route, okay, sir? Okay. Okay. Yes. I don't know. I can't believe he's not out of the room. He just keeps shooting and shooting and shooting. Okay. Yeah, we've got a police officer on scene. I thought it was. Okay, just try and keep the kids in the library calm. Yeah. Is there any way you can block the door so no one can get in?
The Columbine High School massacre took place on April 20th, 1999 in Columbine, Colorado. 15 people, including the 2 shooters, died on that day, and it was for a long time considered the deadliest school shooting in history. It's the event that essentially invented the school shooting as an idea that could happen, though some may dispute that with the University of Texas massacre in 1966. Regardless, it was mostly unheard of for a shooting of this caliber and scope to be perpetrated by students of the targeted school. Until then, a school shooting was mostly a student bringing a gun to a school with the intent to kill 1 or 2 specific individuals, not the entire student and staff population. One of the major follow-ups to this tragic event was the conversation around mental health. Eric Harris was posthumously declared a psychopath due to his apparent enjoyment of the ordeal and his disassociation from basic human empathy. Dylan Klebold was considered to have been severely depressed and suicidal. Many experts see the reasoning behind his motives to be less as a form of enjoyment and more as an act of revenge that would have inevitably led up to a suicide. The 2 considered themselves as complete outcasts from the school and saw the shooting as a way to get back at the society that had seemingly wronged them, according to their journals. Eric Harris was a known fan of Doom. He created his own custom levels and published them on an online forum, now referred to as the Harris levels. One student of Columbine High School that had played Doom with Harris said to police that Harris had told told him that he had modeled a level after Columbine High School, though no such level could be found online. However, there have been levels designed to replicate Columbine High School created by modders in the years following the massacre. The events of April 20th, 1999 called into question entertainment's role in inciting violence or embedding it into the minds of America's youth. Marilyn Manson was one of the most heavily blamed due to the extreme and vulgar nature of his music and with the two shooters being alleged fans, though this was later proven to be false. He repeatedly deflected the blame, instead stating that the news coverage of the Columbine massacre itself was more gruesome than typical entertainment.
If you were to talk directly to the kids at Columbine or the people in that community, what would you say to them if they were here right now?
I wouldn't say a single word to them. I would listen to what they have to say, and that's what no one did.
Manson did bring up a salient point during the controversy, and it's that he believed the media and most Americans sought scapegoats to blame during times of tragedy instead of focusing on the direct issues on hand, such as gun safety and mental health awareness in the case of Columbine. Marilyn Manson would have known too, considering he was one such scapegoat. Even though one of the shooters may have been a fan of Doom, there are plenty of other, more societal reasons why those two high schoolers did the things they did that day. Instead of questioning the cliquish and alienating nature of American high school education, it's Marilyn Manson. Instead of questioning the pressure American schools put on kids throughout their entire lives until adulthood, it's a movie or TV show. Instead of trying to connect with troubled individuals, they're pushed away until they want to push back, sometimes violently.
They just beat it in your head as early as 6th grade.
Right.
Don't fuck up, because if you do, you're gonna die poor and lonely. You don't want to do that. You're like, well, fuck, you know, whatever I am now, I'm that forever. And of course, it's completely opposite. All the dorks in high school go on to do great things, and all the really cool guys are all like living back in Littleton as insurance agents. It's completely, it's almost person to person. It's completely that way. And you just, yeah, if someone could have told them that, maybe they wouldn't have done it, but yeah.
Considering the focus of this series and this channel, it's easy to guess what one of the main scapegoats for Columbine was and continues to be: video games. Video games had just made the jump from 2D to 3D in that decade, and even though it's rudimentary by modern standards, Doom was quite the shocker due to its relatively realistic depiction of violence through the eyes of a virtual human being. The birth of the first-person shooter came from the 3D era of the mid-90s, and while Super Mario 64 and Metal Gear Solid were turning heads due to their revolutionary visuals and gameplay, there were a growing number of citizens concerned with how this technology would represent violence and, in theory, create virtually trained mass shooters. After the news came out that the Norway killer used Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 to quote-unquote train for the massacre of 77 people in 2011, it questioned what the consequences of realistic shooters can be, and if developers should take responsibility for what they create. If a terrorist uses their game to learn certain reloading methods, target acquisition, and other techniques that could be self-taught in the real world based on virtual experience, should developers be held accountable or attempt to remedy this in future installments? Should art be compromised out of fear of potential real-world tragedy? Is the Call of Duty series intentionally avoiding realistic depictions of modern combat as a countermeasure to the events of 2011? The answer isn't as simple as it may seem. Even though an almost non-existent percentage of the world's population will consider these video games as a form of non-informal combat training, it does get a little scarier when you throw in a relatively modern breakthrough in gaming: virtual reality. Of course, VR can't replicate things like the smell of battle and the adrenaline of being in a real firefight, but with the proper peripherals, it could act as a rudimentary substitute for real-world training. If the Norway killer used Modern Warfare 2 to train, why couldn't someone else use a VR program to accomplish the same thing and more efficiently? Seeing real-world killers trained by VR is about as likely as seeing real-world killers trained by any other quote-unquote normal video game, but due to the events in Norway in 2011, it's hard to completely discount the idea. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 was in the news for another reason around the time of its launch, and it wasn't just for its record-breaking sales numbers. In 1999, a real mass shooting shook the airwaves and created a conversation about video game violence. But in 2009, a virtual mass shooting did the exact same thing, acting as both the culmination of decades worth of video game media skepticism and as the basis for any future video game controversy. Even though Grand Theft Auto and Mass Effect were controversial for their inclusion of violent and sexual content, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 was one of the first games to have a specific single moment that changed everything.
С нами Бог. Remember, no Russian.
It's easy to forget, but there was once a time when the most popular pieces of entertainment were also the ones pushing the medium forward in inventive and sometimes controversial ways. It's almost unimaginable that any of the 3 current Call of Duty developers would create a controversial scene akin to No Russian, and even more unimaginable that Activision would publish it. The controversy that tends to attract media coverage, mainstream or otherwise, is usually reserved for patently offensive content or any popular product that contains any sort of violent or sexual content. One of the reasons more games aren't in the news for offensive content is that there are just too many games out there to attract any significant news coverage to anything that's not immensely popular. If your mom doesn't know about a game, Fox News probably won't either. Hatred, as controversial as that game was mostly a self-contained bubble of discussion that remained within the gaming community. It's important to create distinctions between gaming media and mainstream news media.
It had a sort of major multiplayer aspect. That's when players go online and play each other, frag each other as the jargon is.
Within the gaming sphere, something like the Battlefront 2 Star Card situation may have seemed like the most intense, widespread controversy the industry has seen since perhaps the No Man's Sky launch controversy. CNN though? Why would they care? That wasn't an issue that concerned them or their demographic. At least, it might have been had it been framed differently. Most mainstream news media outlets almost exclusively care about news that might directly affect adults and their families. At least, the adults that still have cable subscriptions. If they had seen the Battlefront 2 story, it would have been angled something akin to, is the new Star Wars video game asking children to steal from you? Or, is the new Star Wars Battlefront 2 video game preying on children? The awareness of the existence of a controversy alone would require even a little pre-existing interest in the gaming community and the communities within them. Regardless, it's the games that kids talk about in classrooms that get media coverage. It's the games that football players are playing. It's the games that kids that bully other kids are playing nerdy games play. Those are the games that people outside the gaming sphere notice for better or worse, because those are the games that parents see, and parents are the target demographic for most mainstream news coverage. When a parent sees their child blowing people away in a Star Wars video game, it doesn't get much of a second thought. But when they're doing the same thing in something foreign to them, that's where concern rises.
She wrote about her experience in a blog titled, How I Lost My Children to Fortnite, the post garnering big response from other parents across the country.
The media doesn't harbor some ages-old grudge against video games. The only reason the media reports such seemingly inaccurate and biased stories about how video games are allegedly creating child soldiers is because it suits the narrative that attracts their target demographic. It's the duty of the news media to create a program that appeals to their respective demographics. It's known that Fox News appeals to the right wing, while CNN appeals to the left. It's how they stay on air. However, the two mostly have one thing in common: parents. The reason there hasn't been a huge amount of video game controversy in recent years is also due to the fact that a lot of new parents have either cut cable or get their news from other sources that appeal more directly to their individual interests. Also, millennials are becoming parents, and millennials are the ones who have grown up with gaming in some aspect and mostly understand that video games are just like any other entertainment medium and not always meant for children. The reason why many parents or other members of the older generation are so critical of video games is that, for a long time, video games had widely been considered toys for children. When a game like Modern Warfare 2 drops, which allows players to participate in a virtual terrorist attack, it seems as if developers were targeting children by gamifying a mass shooting with high scores and extra lives. The idea of a narrative with actors and a gripping plot is lost because that isn't the idea of what a video game is to them. Even though video games are the most rapidly evolving entertainment medium out there, the unfortunate common perception is that they haven't changed on a conceptual level since their origins in the 70s and 80s. They understand that they're in 3D now with fancy graphics, of course, but there's still the idea that games are inherently point-based and designed to be purely for fun. The idea of a game like The Last of Us bringing grown men and women to tears, or the shocking content of Outlast being fascinating, is a foreign concept. If the player is shooting people, it must be because the game is telling them it's fun to shoot people, right? Of course, visceral games like Doom and Wolfenstein make it fun to shoot guns at demons and Nazis respectively, but most games that involve violence usually give a narrative reason as to why it's okay to shoot the bad guys. They're an invading army, or they're mercenaries hired by an evil man seeking a dangerous lost treasure, or they're an alien race dedicated to the eradication of humans. Usually whenever there isn't a specified reason to be shooting people in a game, it's because the game wants the player to feel bad about the act of killing someone, which again just isn't a concept that's easy to fathom for a lot of people. Fortnite then. It's a bit hard explaining to people who demonize gaming as something that glorifies violence when the most popular game on the planet right now is all about killing other players for fun. But it does speak volumes on the kind of coverage video games receive in the mainstream. In 2009, it was scary that the biggest game on the planet had a scene depicting a terrorist attack that allowed the player to participate. In 2018, it's scary that a game features guns altogether. Think about that for a second. Why would a game that's not presenting anything close to the heaviness of a mass shooting receive the same kind of scrutiny and attention? It all circles back to an earlier statement. It's the games that kids talk about in classrooms that get media coverage. Even when something like the No Man's Sky launch controversy happens, which seemingly shook the entire gaming world, it's only a unique subsection of the world's population that feels attached to that story. It doesn't suit the mainstream news' narrative for what its demographics should care about. It's why gaming news outlets like IGN, GameSpot, and Game Informer exist in the first place, to report on stories unique to the gaming industry that avid video game players care about. The demographic of Fox News, CNN, or ABC News isn't gamers, and that's exactly why their video game coverage is often inaccurate, misinformed, or biased. They hold zero credibility when it comes to gaming news, which is why it's so frustrating seeing some of their personalities saying things that are straight up wrong to a demographic that will believe whatever they have to say.
And you know what? It's actually really disturbing and intellectually dishonest and somewhat pernicious to try to say that with all the other ills in the world, where you have kids that are getting absolutely poor education in public schools, where they're not getting good medical care given to our healthcare system, and with all, and with the fact that people can't seem to get a decent job, though, what is causing trouble among America's youth in schools? Oh, it has to be a video game. Anyone of thought should find that insulting at the face of it.
There has been one man more prevalent in the fight against mature video games than any other human being on the planet, and his name is Jack Thompson. Before he set his sights on video games, he was a strong activist against any kind of mature or indecent content that could end up in the hands of the youth, most notably rap music in the 90s. Grand Theft Auto Vice City is the game that turned him over and into the infamous legend we know today. Thompson was immensely concerned with the effects of violent video games on children and teenagers. As an attorney, he filed lawsuit after lawsuit against video game developers and publishers, essentially stating that it was their fault these games got in the hands of the wrong people.
Grand Theft Auto 3 as a murder and carjacking simulator to train teens on how to do carjackings, and one of the kids said, "We played the game by day and we lived the game by night." It's a murder simulator.
Thompson didn't find much success as an attorney in his fight against alleged video game indecency. However, once he took more of an activist role and began appearing on television programs and debates, that's when his voice was more prominently heard by both sides who agreed and disagreed. It's not really necessary to pick apart some of his arguments about the legality of selling M-rated games to minors, because they were simply either ill-researched or intentionally skewed to suit an anti-gaming narrative. One of his biggest lobbying points was that it was apparently completely common to sell M-rated games to children, and that by making a game M-rated, developers admit they're harmful to minors.
In that regard, and the industry itself labels these games as adult or mature. And therefore, we're simply saying to the industry, if you're going to label these things and admit that they're harmful to minors, stop selling them to them.
Of course, some parents buy their children games like Grand Theft Auto 5 and Call of Duty World War II without even thinking twice, but most retailers that specialize in video games do require parental permission for any minor wanting to purchase an M-rated product thanks to the ESRB. Even articles written 10 years ago in 2008 state that it was becoming increasingly difficult for children to buy M-rated games. In 2011, games were officially declared art by the Supreme Court, placing them under the same First Amendment protections as movies, books, and music. So that should have been it, right? After the Sandy Hook massacre of 2012, then Vice President Joe Biden called together a meeting of the presidential cabinet and some of the gaming industry's top American representatives, such as John Riccitiello, former CEO of EA. Biden suggested that perhaps a tax on violent video games would make sure that only the people who really wanted them would get them, though this idea was merely a suggestion and was never intently considered. Ultimately, the meeting was inconclusive, leaving the industry essentially as it already was. Just this year, in February 2018, President Donald Trump met with video game executives from Take-Two, which owns Rockstar, ZeniMax, who owns Bethesda, and the ESA, as well as critics and other politicians. Even Republican Senator Marco Rubio chimed in, noting that psychologists have found no substantial evidence that could link violent video games and real-world violence. Of course, in part 1 of this series, this information has already been covered. For the meeting, a compilation of clips from violent video games was created, which has since been heavily criticized for showcasing the clips without any sort of narrative or gameplay context, and for potentially skewing the message as a result. A ghost of the past even reared its head for the meeting, with Jack Thompson getting in touch with Kotaku writer Jason Schreier, simply telling him the meeting would have people of great interest to the video game folks. Thompson was not in attendance of the meeting, but it is interesting to note that, even though he hasn't been in the attorney or activist game for a while since his disbarment in 2008, Jack Thompson still lurks behind the scenes to this day. Should we as an industry and a community be afraid of the day that the government finally cracks down on mature content and stops this cool little thing we've had going on? No. After the Supreme Court decided that video games were to be considered art and to be protected under the First Amendment, it effectively ended any major threat right then and there. Could that decision be revoked? Perhaps. Though, in the dozens of hours of research that has gone into this series so far, most of the articles and videos on the topic of video game violence were in support of gaming. Even from websites like the New York Times, CNN, and more, it was legitimately difficult to find articles and editorials that demonized video games. After years and years of research, it finally seems that we as a collective are mostly at an agreement that video games are not linked to mass shootings or other violent crime. Yes, we still have talking heads on morning talk shows and political activists who are afraid of this relatively new medium of entertainment. However, the problem is not as severe as it might seem on the surface. As more and more kids grow up with gaming, and as those kids are put into positions of authority, this problem can only get better. Those presenters on Fox News and Good Morning America, it might take a few years, but their replacements might even be gamers themselves one day. Ever since Pong found itself in shopping malls as an arcade cabinet in 1972, there has not been a single person born in America without a video game existing in their lives in some capacity. It's highly unlikely that, as time goes on, this problem gets worse. Is the biased, inaccurate presentation of gaming in the mainstream news frustrating? Yes. Is seeing the President of the United States seemingly aligning himself with an anti-video game stance concerning? Of course. But just as the mainstream news media doesn't seem to care about the goings-ons in the gaming community, why should the gaming community care about the goings-ons in the mainstream news media?